The Congo that could have developed under Hammarskjöld's vision, a united nation controlling its own resources, never materialized. Instead, foreign companies continued to extract wealth while ordinary Congolese remained impoverished. The country became a Cold War battleground. Millions died in subsequent conflicts, and the pattern of exploitation that Hammarskjöld fought against continues to this day. Would he have succeeded in changing this trajectory? Maybe not. But he deserved the chance to try, and the Congolese people deserved to see whether a different approach to independence and development might work. That possibility was eliminated on September 17, 1961. There's also the matter of justice. 16 people died when the Albertina crashed. Most were UN staff doing their jobs trying to make peace. They deserve to have their deaths properly investigated. Their families deserve to know the truth. Not the comfortable lie of pilot error, but the actual circumstances that led to their deaths. Harold Julian, the security officer who survived just long enough to testify, died trying to tell the truth. His testimony was ignored and suppressed. He deserves to have his words finally taken seriously, to have his sacrifice recognized. The witnesses on the ground who reported what they saw deserve acknowledgement that they were telling the truth all along. And there's the principle of accountability. If governments and corporations can conspire to assassinate a UN Secretary General and get away with it, what does that say about international law and justice? If such a crime can be committed and covered up for generations, what other crimes are being hidden? The continued classification of files related to this case is an ongoing scandal. We're not talking about recent events where source protection might be legitimate. We're talking about something that happened 65 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. The Cold War is over. The classified files serve no current intelligence purpose. They're being kept secret solely to avoid embarrassment and accountability. This matters because transparency and truth are foundational to democratic institutions. When governments can lie about major events and maintain those lies for generations, public trust erodes. People become cynical about official narratives. They start doubting everything they're told. And while some skepticism of authority is healthy, the widespread belief that governments routinely lie about major events undermines social cohesion. The Hammarskjöld case is also a precedent for how modern assassinations might be handled. The techniques used, making it look like an accident, controlling the investigation, classifying evidence, suppressing witnesses, could be replicated. In fact, they probably have been. The lesson learned from successfully covering up Hammarskjöld's murder is that such operations can work if managed properly. This is why truth commissions and historical accountability matter. Not to punish people long dead, but to establish that such actions will eventually be exposed and condemned. To create deterrence against future conspiracies. To show that while cover-ups might work temporarily, the truth has a way of emerging eventually. But in this case, the truth still hasn't fully emerged. And with each passing year, it becomes less likely that it ever will. Physical evidence deteriorates. Documents are destroyed. Witnesses die. Institutional memory fades. The window for full accountability is closing. Yet the pursuit continues. Researchers keep digging. Journalists keep writing. The UN keeps reluctantly reopening investigations. Because even if justice is impossible, you can't prosecute dead conspirators. Truth still has value. Historical truth, moral truth, the simple acknowledgement of what actually happened. Hammarskjöld himself understood the importance of truth. He wrote, "The road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action." He believed that doing the right thing, even when difficult, was the only path worth following. He died because he refused to compromise on principles. Because he believed the United Nations should serve justice rather than power. His death should mean something. It should be a turning point where the world said, "Never again will we allow a peacemaker to be murdered with impunity." Instead, it became a lesson in how power protects itself, how conspiracies can succeed, how truth can be buried for generations. But it doesn't have to stay buried. The files can still be declassified. The crash site can still be properly excavated. The truth can still emerge. Not in time for justice, perhaps. The guilty are dead. but in time for history, in time for the record to be corrected, in time for Hammarskjöld's vision to be properly honored. That's why this still matters. Not for the past, but for the future. For what we choose to do with the knowledge we've gained. For whether we demand truth and accountability, or whether we accept that some secrets are too dangerous to reveal. The choice is ours, and the world we build depends on which path we choose. We've journeyed through 65 years of evidence, conspiracy, and cover-up. We've examined the witnesses, the suspects, the physical evidence, and the pattern of suppression. We've seen how every attempt to uncover the truth has been frustrated by classified files, convenient deaths, and official intransigence. So where does that leave us? The truth about Dag Hammarskjöld's death exists somewhere between absolute certainty and complete mystery. We know enough to be sure the official story is false. Pilot error doesn't explain Harold Julian's testimony. The witnesses who saw fire in the sky, the NSA intercepts of an attack, the metal fragments found in trees, or the decades-long cover-up. But we don't have courtroom proof. We don't have a confession from the killers. We don't have declassified orders authorizing the assassination. We have circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and a mountain of suspicious coincidences. Enough to build a compelling case, but not enough to prove it beyond all doubt. This might be the most sophisticated aspect of the conspiracy. The people behind it didn't try to hide all the evidence. That would have been impossible and suspicious. Instead, they hid just enough to prevent definitive conclusions while allowing enough to leak out to fuel investigation. The result is a mystery that can never quite be solved but never quite goes away. This serves multiple purposes. Keeps researchers busy chasing leads that go nowhere. It allows governments to claim they're cooperating while releasing nothing useful. It creates plausible deniability. We don't know exactly what happened, so we can't make accusations. And it ensures that anyone who speaks definitively about the case can be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. But the circumstantial evidence, taken as a whole, points in one direction. Hammarskjöld's aircraft was shot down by mercenary pilots, likely Jan van Rissegem or someone working with him. The attack was facilitated by intelligence provided by Western agencies, probably British MI6 and possibly the CIA. The operation was funded by mining companies who stood to lose billions if he succeeded. And the cover-up was coordinated across multiple governments to prevent diplomatic catastrophe. This isn't speculation. This is the conclusion that fits all the available evidence. Every piece we've examined, from Julian's testimony to the bullet hole in the playing card to the radio intercepts to the missing files, supports this narrative. The alternative explanations require believing in impossibly unlikely coincidences. Yet this conclusion will probably never be officially acknowledged. The governments involved will never admit their role. The files will remain classified until everyone who might be affected by their release is dead. By then, the truth will be a historical curiosity rather than a contemporary scandal. But the secret refuses to die. Each generation of researchers discovers the case anew. New evidence emerges from archives. New witnesses come forward. New forensic techniques become available. The truth keeps trying to break through, even though powerful forces keep pushing it back down. Why? Why does this case have such staying power? Partly because Hammarskjöld was an important figure whose death changed history. Partly because the evidence of conspiracy is so strong that it can't be completely ignored. But also because the case represents something larger. It represents the question of whether justice can be achieved when power wants to prevent it. The Hammarskjöld investigation has become a test. Can truth survive sustained institutional opposition? Can evidence overcome classification and cover-up? Can the determined efforts of researchers and journalists eventually break through walls of secrecy? So far, the answer has been almost, but not quite. Before we begin tonight's story, if you appreciate these detailed investigations into unsolved mysteries and missing persons cases, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves true crime. Your support helps keep these stories alive and brings attention to cases that desperately need to be solved. Now let's begin. Springfield, Missouri, June 7th, 1992. The sun rose over a quiet residential street in a middle-class neighborhood. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of morning when families would be getting ready for church, when children would be sleeping in after a late night, when the world moved at a slower pace. But at 1717 East Delmar Street, something was terribly wrong. Inside a small, tidy house, 3 women had vanished. Cheryl Levitt, 47 years old, a hairdresser and devoted mother. Suzanne Streeter, 19 years old, Cheryl's daughter, full of life and ready to start the next chapter of her future. And Stacy McCall, 18 years old, Suzanne's best friend, a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. They had disappeared sometime in the early morning hours, taken from the safety of their own home. No bodies, no witnesses, no suspects, no answers. Just 3 women, gone without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that has haunted Springfield for over 30 years. This is the story of the Springfield 3, a case so baffling that it has defied every attempt to solve it. A case where the evidence points in a dozen different directions and yet leads nowhere. A case that asks a single chilling question. How do 3 people vanish from a house in the middle of the night without leaving a single clue? Cheryl Elizabeth Levitt was born on November 1st, 1944, in Seattle, Washington. She grew up in Bellevue, a suburb east of Seattle, surrounded by forests and mountains. Her younger sister Deborah remembers a childhood filled with camping trips, ocean excursions, and outdoor adventures. Cheryl was 8 years older than Deborah, and like many older siblings, she found her little sister to be somewhat annoying. But there was love there, the kind of bond that sisters share even when they're separated by distance and time. Cheryl eventually moved to Springfield, Missouri, where she built a life for herself. She became a cosmetologist, working at local salons and eventually operating a hairstyling business from her home. She was known in the community as a skilled stylist, someone who took pride in her work and cared deeply about her clients. Cheryl was a single mother, having divorced years earlier, and she had 2 children. Her son Bart was older and had moved out on his own. Her daughter Suzanne, who went by Susie, still lived with her. The 2 were close, more like best friends than mother and daughter. Cheryl had recently moved into the house on East Delmar Street, a modest ranch-style home that she was slowly renovating. She had plans to repaint, to redecorate, to make it truly her own. On the evening of June 6, 1992, Cheryl spoke on the phone with a friend at approximately 11:15. They talked about painting and varnishing an armoire in her bedroom. It was a mundane conversation, the kind of conversation people have every day. Cheryl had no idea that, in just a few hours, she would be gone. Suzanne Elizabeth Streeter was born on March 9, 1973. She was 19 years old in the summer of 1992, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. Susie was described by those who knew her as vibrant, fashionable, and full of personality. She had shoulder-length blonde hair, brown eyes, and a smile that lit up a room. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 102 pounds. Susie had a small scar on her upper right forearm, a tiny mole at the left corner of her mouth, and both of her ears were pierced, the left ear pierced twice. These were the distinguishing features that would later be listed on missing persons flyers, the details that might help someone identify her if she were ever found. Susie worked at a local movie theater and had recently graduated from Kickapoo High School. Well, not quite graduated. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for June 6, 1992, and Susie was excited. She had big plans for after graduation. She wanted to celebrate with her friends, to party, to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Susie had recently moved back in with her mother after living elsewhere for a time. She and Cheryl had a strong relationship. They were close in a way that not all mothers and daughters are. Susie was excited to show her best friend Stacy her new room, and especially her new king-sized waterbed, a graduation present she had just received. That waterbed, that room, that house on Delmar Street. It should have been a place of celebration and new beginnings. Instead, it became a crime scene. Stacy Kathleen McCall was born on April 23, 1974, making her 18 years old in June of 1992. She was born and raised in Springfield, the youngest of 3 siblings, with an older sister and brother. Stacy grew up in a middle-class family. Her father, Stuart McCall, worked in the automotive industry, and her mother, Janice, was a devoted parent who cared deeply for her children. Stacy attended Kickapoo High School, the same school as Susie Streeter. The 2 girls were best friends, inseparable in the way teenage girls often are. Stacy was popular among her peers, known for her outgoing personality and infectious smile. She loved dancing and was an accomplished athlete, playing softball and running track. During her senior year, she was elected to the homecoming court, a recognition of how well-liked and respected she was by her classmates. Stacy had plans for the future. She intended to attend Missouri State University in the fall, pursuing a degree in business. She was responsible, reliable, the kind of young woman who called her mother to let her know where she was and when she'd be home. Stacy had a bright future ahead of her. She just needed to get through one more night of celebration, one more evening with her best friend, before the real world began. She never got that chance. June 6, 1992, was graduation day for the Kickapoo High School class of 1992. The ceremony took place at 4 in the afternoon at the Hammond Student Center on the campus of Southwest Missouri State University, now known as Missouri State University. Hundreds of students walked across the stage, receiving their diplomas, posing for photographs, celebrating with their families. Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall were among them. After the ceremony, both girls went home to their respective families. Susie had photographs taken at her mother's house on Delmar Street with her friend Nigel Kenny. Stacy went home and had photographs taken with her graduation cake. Her parents gave her a Cocker Spaniel puppy as a graduation present. The celebrations continued into the evening. Susie, Stacy, and another friend named Janelle Kirby had made plans to attend several graduation parties that night. The original plan was for all 3 girls to spend the night at Janelle's house in the nearby town of Battlefield, a small community just southeast of Springfield. The next morning, they planned to drive to Branson, Missouri, a popular tourist destination about 40 miles south, where they would meet other friends at Whitewater, a water park. It was going to be a perfect day, a perfect way to celebrate the end of high school and the beginning of summer. But plans change. Around 10:30 in the evening, Stacy called her mother Janice from Janelle Kirby's house. Stacy told her mother about the plans for the evening and the trip to Branson the next day. Janice McCall was concerned. She advised Stacy not to drive to Branson that night because she was worried about the possibility of a car accident. Teenagers at graduation parties often drank alcohol, and Janice didn't want her daughter or her friends getting behind the wheel if they'd been drinking. Stacy promised her mother that they would wait until the next morning to drive to Branson. She also promised to call her mother the next day. It was a normal conversation between a mother and daughter, the kind of conversation that happens in households across the country every single night. Janice had no reason to worry. Stacy was a responsible girl. She would keep her promise. Except she didn't, because by the time the sun rose on June 7th, Stacy McCall was gone. The 3 girls, Susie, Stacy, and Janelle, left Janelle's house around 11 in the evening and began making the rounds to various graduation parties. They went to several different houses, celebrating with classmates, drinking, laughing, enjoying the freedom that comes with being 18 and 19 years old. One party they attended was at the home of Michelle Elder, another friend. That party was broken up by Springfield police at approximately 1:50 in the morning. The police had received noise complaints, and when they arrived, they found a large gathering of teenagers. The party dispersed and the girls moved on. They returned to Janelle Kirby's house in Battlefield around 2 in the morning. By this point, other friends and relatives had arrived at Janelle's house for her graduation celebration. The house was crowded, packed with people. There wasn't enough space for everyone to sleep comfortably. Susie and Stacy made a decision. Instead of staying at Janelle's house as originally planned, they would go back to Cheryl's house on Delmar Street. There was plenty of room there. Susie wanted to show Stacy her new waterbed anyway. It made sense. Janelle Kirby watched as her 2 friends climbed into Susie's car and pulled out of the driveway. She waved goodbye. She never saw them again. The drive from Battlefield to Cheryl's house on Delmar Street would have taken about 15 minutes. Police later estimated that Susie and Stacy arrived at the house sometime between 2:15 and 2:30 in the morning on June 7th. What happened next is a mystery that has never been solved. When friends and family members entered the house at 1717 East Delmar Street later that day, they found a scene that was both ordinary and deeply disturbing. The front door was unlocked, but in 1992, in a safe neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri, that wasn't unusual. Many people didn't lock their doors. The house was tidy, neat, everything in its place. Susie's bed looked as though it had been slept in. The covers were pulled back, and there were indentations on the pillows. Cheryl's bed also looked slept in. In the living room, the television in Susie's room had been left on. An unopened can of soda sat on a table next to a pack of cigarettes. Both Susie and Cheryl were smokers, and the fact that they had left their cigarettes behind was strange. Smokers don't usually leave the house without their cigarettes. All of the women's personal belongings were still in the house. Their purses were neatly placed in a bedroom. Inside the purses were their driver's licenses, their money, their keys. Susie's car was parked in the driveway. Cheryl's car was parked in the carport. The keys to both vehicles were inside the house. The women's jewelry, their clothing, everything they would need if they were planning to leave was still there. The only thing missing was the women themselves. And there was one other detail, one small piece of evidence that suggested something terrible had happened. The globe covering the porch light near the front door was shattered. Broken glass lay on the porch. It was the only sign of a struggle, the only indication that something violent had occurred. Inside the house, Cheryl's dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was found in the house. The dog appeared agitated, more nervous than usual. Cinnamon had been left behind, just like everything else. Whoever had taken the three women had left the dog. They had left the money, the cars, the purses, the keys, the cigarettes. They had taken only the women. And they had done it so quietly, so carefully, that no neighbors reported hearing anything unusual. No screams, no sounds of a struggle, no cars speeding away. It was as if the three women had simply vanished into thin air. But there was one more piece of evidence, one critical detail that might have provided a clue. There was a message on the answering machine in the house. Police believe that message might have contained information about the disappearance, possibly even the voice of the person responsible. But before police could hear the message, it was erased. One of the friends who entered the house that day, trying to be helpful, had listened to the messages on the answering machine and deleted them, thinking they were just routine calls. That message, whatever it contained, was lost forever. The contamination of the crime scene didn't stop there. By the time police arrived at the house later that day, between 10 and 20 people had already been inside. Friends, family members, concerned neighbors, they had walked through the house, touched things, moved things. Some had even cleaned up, sweeping the broken glass from the porch, tidying the rooms, emptying ashtrays. They were trying to help, trying to make sense of what had happened, but in doing so, they destroyed potential evidence. Fingerprints, DNA, trace evidence that might have pointed to the person responsible, all of it was compromised or lost. The crime scene, if it even was a crime scene at that point, had been irreparably damaged. The timeline of events on the morning of June 7th is critical to understanding what happened. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend Mike Henson drove to Cheryl's house on Delmar Street. They were supposed to meet Susie and Stacy there and then all drive together to Branson for the trip to Whitewater. When they arrived, they found the house quiet. The front door was unlocked. They went inside, calling out for Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl. No one answered. The house was empty. Janelle and Mike looked around, trying to figure out where everyone had gone. They saw the purses, the cars, all the personal belongings. It didn't make sense. Where were they? Janelle tried calling other friends, thinking maybe the women had left early or gone somewhere else. While they were in the house, the phone rang. Janelle answered it. On the other end of the line was a man's voice, making sexual and obscene comments. Janelle hung up immediately. The phone rang again almost immediately. Again, it was the same man making the same kind of disturbing remarks. Janelle hung up again. She would later tell police that the calls were unsettling, but she didn't think much of it at the time. Susie had mentioned receiving prank calls at the house before, and Janelle assumed this was just another one. Janelle and Mike left the house and went to Branson as planned, thinking that maybe Susie, Stacy, and Cheryl would show up later. But they never did. As the hours passed, concern grew. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, was expecting a call from her daughter. That call never came. Stacy was supposed to check in to let her mother know she was okay, but the phone remained silent. By mid-afternoon, Janice McCall decided to drive to Cheryl's house to see what was going on. She arrived at the house around 2:30 in the afternoon. She went inside, just as Janelle and Mike had done hours earlier. She saw the same scene: the unlocked door, the personal belongings, the cars, no people. Janice found the 3 purses in the bedroom, each one neatly placed, each one containing money, identification, everything a woman would need if she left the house. Janice knew immediately that something was very wrong. Her daughter would not have left without her purse. She would not have left without calling. Something terrible had happened. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Janice McCall called the Springfield Police Department to report her daughter and the other 2 women missing. The police arrived shortly thereafter and began their investigation. But by that time, the crime scene had already been compromised by hours of foot traffic, well-meaning friends and family who had no idea they were destroying evidence. The Springfield Police Department faced an enormous challenge. They had 3 missing women, no witnesses, no clear motive, and a crime scene that had been contaminated before they even arrived. Where do you start with a case like that? The investigation into the disappearance of the Springfield 3 began immediately. The FBI joined the case on June 9th, recognizing that the mysterious nature of the disappearance and the involvement of 3 victims warranted federal assistance. Police worked around the clock, interviewing friends, family, classmates, anyone who might have information. They retraced the girls' movements on the night of June 6th and the early morning of June 7th. They spoke to everyone who had been at the graduation parties. They spoke to neighbors on Delmar Street, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. No one had. The neighborhood had been quiet. No one reported seeing any unfamiliar vehicles. No one heard screams or sounds of a struggle. It was as if the 3 women had been spirited away by ghosts. Police also began searching for the women. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement in massive search efforts. They combed through rural areas surrounding Springfield, searching fields, woods, abandoned buildings. They searched Lake Springfield, bringing in divers to check the depths. They expanded the search to nearby towns like Forsyth, Joplin, Stockton, and Cassville. They distributed missing persons flyers throughout the region, plastering the faces of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy on every available surface. Local businesses displayed the flyers in their windows. The images of the 3 women, frozen in time from 1992, became a haunting reminder of the mystery that had gripped the city. But despite all the effort, despite the thousands of hours spent searching, despite the hundreds of volunteers who dedicated their time, nothing was found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence. The 3 women had simply vanished. As the investigation continued, tips began pouring in. The Springfield Police Department received thousands of leads over the following weeks, months, and years. Some tips seemed promising. Others were clearly false or based on speculation. One of the earliest and most intriguing tips came on December 31st, 1992, 6 months after the disappearance. A man called the America's Most Wanted hotline with information about the case. The caller spoke to a switchboard operator and indicated that he had knowledge about what had happened to the women. The operator attempted to transfer the call to Springfield investigators so they could speak directly with the man. But when the transfer was attempted, the call was disconnected. The caller never called back. Police described the caller as someone who had prime knowledge of the abductions, suggesting that he knew details that had not been made public. They publicly appealed for the man to contact them again, but he never did. To this day, no one knows who that caller was or what information he possessed. Was he the person responsible, calling to taunt the police? Was he a witness who saw something but got cold feet about coming forward? Or was he just another person seeking attention, claiming to know more than he actually did? The mystery of that phone call has become part of the larger mystery of the case itself. Over the years, several individuals emerged as potential suspects. Some were investigated thoroughly, others were dismissed quickly, but a few names have remained at the center of speculation and investigation for over 30 years. One of those names is Robert Craig Cox. Robert Craig Cox is perhaps the most talked about suspect in the Springfield 3 case, though police have never officially named him as a suspect. Cox was born and raised in Springfield. He had joined the Army and became a ranger, but his military career was cut short after he was involved in violent incidents. In 1985, Cox pleaded guilty to kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon in California. He had stalked and kidnapped 2 women in separate incidents. Both women managed to escape and testified that they believed Cox intended to kill them. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison and was dishonorably discharged from the Army. While serving that sentence, Florida authorities charged Cox with the 1978 murder of Sharon Zellers, a 19-year-old woman who worked at Walt Disney World. Zellers had been found beaten to death in a motel room in Orlando where Cox and his family had been staying. The evidence against Cox was weak. He had a cut on his tongue, and hair and blood samples found near the victim were compatible with his, but the case was largely circumstantial. Nevertheless, Cox was convicted of first-degree murder in 1988 and sentenced to death. He was sent to Florida's death row, where he was housed near infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. But in 1990, in a rare ruling, the Florida Supreme Court reversed Cox's conviction. The court ruled that the evidence had created only a suspicion of guilt and was not sufficient to support a conviction. Cox was acquitted and released from death row. He was sent back to California to finish serving his sentence for the earlier kidnapping and assault convictions. He was released from prison in December 1990. 1 week after his release, Robert Craig Cox returned to Springfield, Missouri, his hometown. He moved in with his adoptive parents and tried to resume a normal life. He was in Springfield in June 1992 when the Springfield 3 disappeared. When police began investigating the case, they interviewed Cox as part of their efforts to speak with anyone who might have information. Cox told police that on the morning of June 7th, he was at church with his girlfriend. She corroborated his alibi, confirming that they had been together. However, years later, the girlfriend recanted her statement. She admitted that Cox had asked her to lie for him. Cox then changed his story, claiming that he had been at his parents' house on the night of the disappearance. His parents confirmed this alibi, but investigators remained suspicious. Cox's history of violence against women, his proximity to the crime, and inconsistencies in his statements made him a person of interest. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the disappearance. No witnesses placed him at Cheryl's house. There was nothing concrete, and without evidence, police couldn't move forward. Cox left Springfield in the early 1990s and moved to Texas. In November 1994, he committed an armed robbery at a tanning salon in Decatur, Texas. During the robbery, he held a gun to the head of a 12-year-old girl. No one was injured, but Cox was arrested and charged. In 1995, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for that crime, later increased to a life sentence. It was while he was in prison in Texas that Robert Craig Cox made the statements that would forever link him to the Springfield 3 case. In January 1996, Springfield police traveled to Texas to interview Cox in prison. During those conversations, Cox was described as friendly and affable, but he also told investigators things about the disappearance that they found disturbing. Cox implied that he had knowledge of what had happened, though he stopped short of confessing. He told police things that made them say they couldn't eliminate him as a suspect. Later that year, Cox gave an interview to a reporter from the Springfield news leader named Dennis Graves. During that interview, Cox made a chilling statement. He said, "I just know that they are dead. That's not my theory. I just know that. There's no doubt about that. When asked directly if he had abducted the women, Cox responded, "That's a frivolous question. Obviously, I'm going to say no." Cox also stated that the women had been murdered and buried in Springfield and that their bodies would never be recovered. He told the reporter and later told authorities that he would disclose what happened to the 3 women after his mother died. His mother is still alive today. Cox remains in prison in Texas, serving his life sentence. He is eligible for parole in 2025. Over the years, Cox has continued to taunt investigators and journalists, dropping hints, making vague statements, but never providing concrete information. Many people believe Cox is responsible for the disappearance of the Springfield 3. They point to his history of violence, his presence in Springfield at the time of the crime, and his own statements suggesting he has knowledge of the case. But others believe Cox is simply seeking attention, trying to build a mystique around himself, trying to make his life seem more significant than it actually is. Police have stated publicly that they do not believe Cox has any credibility. Without evidence, without a confession, without anything more than his own words, Robert Craig Cox remains a person of interest but not a confirmed suspect. Another name that has surfaced repeatedly in connection with the case is Gerald Carnahan. Carnahan was a well-known figure in Springfield, a businessman with a dark side. In 1985, a young woman named Jackie Johns disappeared from her car on U.S. Highway 160. Her purse and keys were left inside, and the driver's door was open. Her body was found later in Lake Springfield. She had been beaten to death. Carnahan was named as a suspect in her murder, but he was not charged at the time. In 1987, another young woman named Debbie Sue Lewis vanished under eerily similar circumstances. She disappeared from her car on the same highway. Her purse and keys were left inside. Her skeleton was discovered months later in Newton County. Carnahan was again named as a suspect but was never charged. In the spring of 1993, less than a year after the Springfield 3 disappeared, Carnahan was arrested after attempting to kidnap a woman from a sidewalk near Sunshine Street and Ingram Mill Road in Springfield. He served 2 years in prison for that crime. It wasn't until 2010, 25 years after the murder of Jackie Johns, that Carnahan was finally convicted of her killing. DNA evidence linked him to the crime. Some investigators and amateur sleuths believe Carnahan could also be responsible for the disappearance of the Springfield 3. His pattern of targeting young women, his history of violence, and his presence in Springfield all make him a viable suspect. But like Cox, there is no physical evidence linking Carnahan to the case. Another individual who drew attention was Stephen Garrison, a member of the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club. Garrison claimed he had overheard someone confess to killing the 3 women at a drug party. He said the bodies had been taken to a hog farm in Webster County. Police took Garrison's claims seriously at first because he provided information that had not been made public, suggesting he might actually know something. A judge even lowered Garrison's bail based on the possibility that he was cooperating with the investigation. But Garrison fled. A few days later, he broke into a woman's apartment in Springfield and attacked her. She survived and testified against him. Garrison was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison for rape, sodomy, burglary, and robbery. Police later backed off from Garrison as a suspect, concluding that his claims were unreliable. Another name that occasionally comes up is Dustin Reckla, a former boyfriend of Susie Streeter. Months before the women vanished, Reckla had broken into a Springfield mausoleum and stolen $30 worth of gold fillings from a skull. Susie had given police a statement about the incident, and some speculated that Reckla might have wanted revenge. Reckla took a lie detector test in June 1992, passed it, and denied any involvement in the disappearances. He testified before a grand jury investigating the case in 1994 and has maintained his innocence. He now lives in Colorado. Police have eliminated him as a suspect. One of the most persistent theories about the case involves a serial killer named Larry Dwayne Hall. Hall was a Civil War reenactor who traveled throughout the Midwest in the 1980s and 90s. He was convicted of kidnapping and murdering 15-year-old Jessica Roach in 1993. Hall confessed to numerous other murders, though many of his confessions have been inconsistent and unreliable. Nearly all of Hall's alleged murders occurred during specific months: March, June, August, and September, correlating with the dates of Civil War reenactments. On June 6, 1992, there were 2 Civil War reenactments in Pleasant Hope, Missouri, located 30 minutes north of Springfield. Hall was known to attend such events. A former FBI operative named Jimmy Keene was tasked with befriending Hall in prison and gaining his trust. Keene reported that Hall admitted to specific details about many of his crimes, details that only the killer could have known. Hall also supposedly had a map of his victims, though that map has never been found. Some people believe Hall was responsible for the disappearance of the Springfield Three. A witness reported seeing a blonde woman driving an older Dodge van on the morning of June 7th, with a man in the back seat telling her not to do anything stupid. Hall owned a Dodge van that matched the description. However, police have investigated Hall thoroughly and have found no credible evidence linking him to the case. They believe his claims, like many of his other confessions, are unreliable. In 2007, a new lead emerged that captured widespread attention. A crime reporter named Kat Hebard received a tip that the bodies of the 3 women were buried beneath the south parking garage at Cox South Hospital in Springfield. The tipster claimed to have knowledge of the burial site, though police later stated that the tip came from someone who claimed to be psychic or to have had a dream or vision about the case. Baird invited Rick Norland, a mechanical engineer, to scan a corner of the parking garage using ground-penetrating radar. Norland's equipment detected 3 anomalies, roughly the same size, that he said were consistent with gravesite locations. 2 of the anomalies were parallel, and the other was perpendicular, as if 3 bodies had been buried there. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the case. Families of the victims, particularly Janice McCall, urged Springfield police to excavate the site, but police refused. They stated that the tip was not credible and that the parking garage had not even begun construction until September 1993, over a year after the women disappeared. They argued that excavating the parking garage would be extremely costly and that without reasonable belief that the bodies were actually there, it was illogical to proceed. Daryl Moore, a former assistant at the Greene County Prosecutor's Office, confirmed that the tip came from someone claiming to have psychic knowledge, further undermining its credibility. To this day, the parking garage has never been excavated. The 3 anomalies detected by the ground-penetrating radar remain a tantalizing but unproven lead. Some people believe the police made a mistake by not investigating further. Others believe the police made the right decision, that the tip was baseless and that excavating the garage would have been a waste of resources. The debate continues. In April 2003, another search took place on farmland south of Cassville, Missouri, based on tips received by investigators. Using backhoes, crews dug large holes in the ground, searching for any sign of the missing women. They found 2 pieces of possible evidence. One was a substance that might have been blood. The other was a section of a green vehicle, possibly a van. The green van was significant because several witnesses had reported seeing a green van in the area around the time of the disappearance. The blood evidence was sent to a specialized lab for testing, but the results were inconclusive. The vehicle section could not be definitively linked to the case. The search of the farmland yielded no further leads. Over the years, countless other searches have been conducted in various locations around Springfield and the surrounding area. Rural fields, wooded areas, abandoned properties, every place that seemed even remotely plausible has been checked and rechecked. But the 3 women have never been found. On January 1st, 1997, 5 years after their disappearance, Cheryl Levitt and Suzanne Streeter were declared legally dead. Stacy McCall was also declared legally dead. The declaration allowed their families to begin the painful process of moving forward, though it provided no closure. Their case files, however, remain officially listed as missing, not as homicides. This distinction is important because it means that police are still treating the case as a missing persons investigation, even though most people, including the police themselves, believe the women are dead. The families of the Springfield Three have endured unimaginable pain. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, has become the most public face of the case. She has spent over 30 years fighting for answers, attending memorial events, speaking to journalists, appearing on television programs, doing anything she can to keep the case in the public eye. In a 2017 interview, Janice said, "I expected her home that night, the next day, maybe a couple of days afterward. Never in my wildest imagination did I ever think that it would be 25 years later, and I would be saying Stacy is still missing." Janice founded a nonprofit organization called One Missing Link, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons. She has worked with the National Center for Missing Adults and has kept Stacy's memory alive through billboards, interviews, and local events. For Janice, every day without answers is a day of torment. She doesn't know what happened to her daughter. She doesn't know if Stacy suffered. She doesn't know where her body is. She cannot bury her child. That is a pain that few people can comprehend. Deborah Schwartz, Cheryl's younger sister, has also spoken publicly about the case. Deborah and Cheryl grew up together in Washington State, and though they were 8 years apart in age, they shared a bond. Deborah visited Cheryl and Susie in Springfield just weeks before they disappeared. She stayed with them, spent time with them, made memories with them, and then they were gone. Deborah has described the agony of not knowing, of living with the unanswered questions, of wondering if her sister and niece are out there somewhere, if they suffered, if they knew what was happening to them. Susie's older brother Bart has largely stayed out of the public eye, though he has been affected by the case in profound ways. In February 2019, Bart was arrested in Tennessee on suspicion of public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and attempted false imprisonment in an unrelated incident. Years earlier, he had been investigated as a potential suspect in his mother and sister's disappearance, but was eventually eliminated. The trauma of losing his mother and sister, combined with the scrutiny he faced as a potential suspect, took a toll on Bart's life. For all the families involved, the disappearance of the Springfield Three has been a wound that never heals. They live in a state of perpetual limbo, unable to grieve fully because there are no bodies, unable to move forward because there are no answers. The Springfield Three case has become one of the most famous unsolved missing persons cases in American history. It has been featured on countless television programs, including Unsolved Mysteries, Disappeared, and Dateline. Books have been written about it. Podcasts have dissected every detail. True crime enthusiasts and amateur sleuths have devoted countless hours to analyzing the evidence, developing theories, and trying to solve the case. Online forums and social media groups dedicated to the Springfield Three have thousands of members, all sharing information, debating suspects, and hoping that one day, somehow, the mystery will be solved. But despite all the attention, despite all the effort, despite more than 30 years of investigation, the case remains unsolved. 3 women vanished from a house in the middle of the night, and no one knows who took them or why. No one knows where their bodies are. No one knows the truth. So what happened to Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall? That is the question that has haunted Springfield for over 3 decades. There are many theories, some more plausible than others. One theory is that the women were targeted by someone they knew, someone who had access to the house, someone who knew Cheryl's routine, someone who might have had a key or knew the house would be unlocked. This theory suggests that the perpetrator entered the house quietly, possibly with a weapon, and forced the 3 women to leave without a struggle. The shattered porch light could have been broken during the abduction, either by accident or as part of a struggle. The women were then taken somewhere, killed, and buried. This theory aligns with the statements made by Robert Craig Cox, who claimed the women were murdered and buried in Springfield and that their bodies would never be recovered. If Cox is telling the truth, then the women are somewhere in or around the city, buried in a location that only the killer knows. But there are problems with this theory. If the women were taken by someone they knew, why didn't the dog bark? Why didn't the neighbors hear anything? And if the perpetrator had a key or knew the house would be unlocked, why was the porch light broken? Those questions remain unanswered. Another theory is that the women were the victims of a random crime, a home invasion gone wrong. Perhaps someone was burglarizing homes in the neighborhood and chose Cheryl's house as a target. When the burglar encountered 3 women inside, he panicked and abducted them to prevent them from identifying him. This theory would explain why the crime scene was relatively undisturbed, why there were no signs of a prolonged struggle, and why the women's belongings were left behind. The perpetrator wasn't interested in stealing anything. He was interested in covering his tracks. But this theory also has problems. If the crime was random, it's unlikely the perpetrator would have been able to control 3 women simultaneously without making noise or attracting attention. And if the women were taken to prevent them from identifying the burglar, why weren't they killed at the scene? Why go through the trouble of abducting them, transporting them, and disposing of their bodies elsewhere? It doesn't quite add up. A third theory is that the women were victims of a serial killer, someone like Larry Dwayne Hall or another predator who was passing through the area. This theory is supported by the fact that there were other unsolved disappearances and murders in Missouri during the same time period. Jackie Johns, Debbie Sue Lewis, and others who vanished under similar circumstances. If a serial killer was operating in the region, the Springfield 3 could have been part of a larger pattern of crimes. The problem with this theory is that serial killers typically have a preferred victim type. They don't usually target 3 women at once, especially not women of different ages. Serial killers also tend to work alone, and controlling 3 victims simultaneously would be extremely difficult. Unless the killer had an accomplice, it's hard to see how a single person could have abducted all 3 women without leaving more evidence behind. A fourth theory, and one that has gained traction in recent years, is that the women's disappearance was connected to the drug trade. Springfield, Missouri, in the early 1990s was experiencing a significant drug problem, particularly with methamphetamine. Some people believe that Cheryl, or possibly Susie, was involved with individuals connected to the drug trade, and that the abduction was either retaliation for a debt, a deal gone wrong, or a message sent to someone else. This theory is bolstered by the fact that Susie had mentioned receiving prank calls at the house, and that on the morning of June 7th, Janelle Kirby received obscene phone calls when she was at the house. Could those calls have been warnings? Could they have been connected to whatever happened that night? The drug theory is difficult to prove or disprove because much of the evidence surrounding it is anecdotal or speculative. Friends and family have denied that Cheryl or Susie were involved in drugs, though it's possible they were connected to people who were, either knowingly or unknowingly. If the abduction was drug-related, it's likely that the women's bodies were disposed of in a way that ensured they would never be found. Drug-related killings are often carried out by individuals with experience in violence and in covering their tracks. But again, there is no concrete evidence to support this theory. And then there is the simplest and perhaps most chilling theory of all, that the women were in the wrong time, that someone with violent intent was prowling the neighborhood that night, looking for an opportunity, that someone saw the house, saw that it was quiet, saw that it was vulnerable, and decided to act. This theory requires no elaborate conspiracy, no connection to drugs or serial killers or people the women knew. It simply requires a predator and an opportunity. And on the night of June 6th and the early morning of June 7th, 1992, that opportunity presented itself. 3 women, alone in a house, unprotected, unaware, and someone took advantage. The truth is, we may never know what happened. The Springfield Police Department continues to investigate the case, though leads have dwindled over the years. They receive occasional tips, and they follow up on anything that seems credible. But as time passes, the chances of solving the case grow slimmer. Witnesses die, memories fade, evidence degrades. The window of opportunity for justice closes a little more with each passing year. In 2022, the 30th anniversary of the disappearance, renewed attention was brought to the case. Janice McCall organized a memorial event, and local media covered the anniversary extensively. New billboards were erected in Springfield, featuring the faces of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy, along with a phone number for tips. The Springfield Police Department issued a statement reaffirming their commitment to solving the case. They stated that the investigation remains active, that they continue to receive and follow up on tips, and that they will not give up until the case is solved. But 30 years is a long time. For Janice McCall, it's been 30 years of birthdays without her daughter. 30 years of holidays with an empty seat at the table. 30 years of wondering, hoping, grieving. For Deborah Schwartz, it's been 30 years without her sister and niece. 30 years of living with the knowledge that someone out there knows what happened, and they're keeping that secret. For the community of Springfield, it's been 30 years of looking over their shoulders, of wondering if the person responsible still lives among them, of feeling the shadow of an unsolved crime hanging over their city. The Springfield 3 case is a reminder of how fragile safety can be. It's a reminder that terrible things can happen to anyone, at any time, even in places that seem safe. It's a reminder that justice is not always served, that answers are not always found, and that some mysteries may never be solved. But it's also a reminder of the resilience of those who are left behind. Janice McCall could have given up decades ago. She could have withdrawn from public life, tried to move on, tried to forget. But she didn't. She kept fighting. She kept Stacy's name alive. She refused to let the case be forgotten. And because of her efforts, because of the efforts of families like hers, cases like the Springfield 3 remain in the public consciousness. They remain a priority for law enforcement. They remain a challenge for investigators. And they remain a hope for the families who want nothing more than to bring their loved ones home. If you have any information about the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall, please contact the Springfield Police Department at 417-864-1810. You can also contact the FBI's tip line. Any information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could be the key to solving this case. Cheryl was 47 years old when she disappeared. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall with brown eyes and blonde hair. Susie was 19 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall with brown eyes and blonde hair. Stacy was 18 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall with brown eyes and blonde hair. All 3 women were last seen in the early morning hours of June 7, 1992, at 1717 East Delmar Street in Springfield, Missouri. Someone out there knows what happened to them. Someone out there has the answers that these families have been searching for. If that person is you, please come forward. Do the right thing. Give these families the closure they deserve. Help bring Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy home. The Springfield 3 case is one of the most baffling and heartbreaking unsolved mysteries in American history. 3 women, 3 lives, 3 families destroyed. All because of one terrible night. All because someone made a decision to take them, to hurt them, to hide them away. Whoever did this has lived with that secret for over 30 years. They have gone about their lives, perhaps raising families, perhaps holding down jobs, perhaps even living in Springfield, walking the same streets, shopping in the same stores, existing in the same community that they tore apart. And for 30 years, they have remained silent. But secrets have a way of coming to light. The truth has a way of emerging, even decades after a crime has been committed. Deathbed confessions, guilty consciences, slips of the tongue, advances in forensic technology. All of these things have solved cold cases that seemed hopeless. The Springfield 3 case may still be solved. It may take another 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. But it's possible. And as long as it's possible, there is hope. Hope for Janice McCall, who has spent more than half her life searching for her daughter. Hope for Deborah Schwartz, who wants to know what happened to her sister and niece. Hope for the community of Springfield, which wants answers and justice. Hope for the 3 women themselves, whose voices were silenced on a summer night in 1992, but whose memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them and those who refuse to forget. Cheryl Levitt was a hairdresser, a mother, a sister, a friend. She was 47 years old with her whole life ahead of her. Suzanne Streeter was a daughter, a friend, a young woman just beginning her adult life. She was 19 years old, full of dreams and possibilities. Stacy McCall was a daughter, a sister, a friend, an athlete, a student preparing to go to college. She was 18 years old, ready to take on the world. They deserved to live. They deserved to pursue their dreams, to grow old, to experience all the joys and sorrows that life has to offer. Instead, they were taken. And for over 30 years, they have been lost. But they are not forgotten. Their names are remembered. Their faces are remembered. Their stories are remembered. And as long as people continue to tell those stories, as long as people continue to demand justice, as long as people refuse to give up, there is a chance that one day the truth will come to light. One day, the mystery of the Springfield 3 will be solved. One day, Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy will be brought home. Thank you for listening to this case. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that missing persons cases deserve attention and that families deserve answers, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth investigations into unsolved mysteries. These women deserve justice. Their families deserve closure. And together, we can keep their memory alive and keep the pressure on law enforcement to never give up, to keep searching, to keep investigating, until the day the Springfield 3 are finally found. Until next time, stay safe and never stop seeking the truth.